So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in the INTERSECT webinar series. The INTERSECT project is a project hosted at MF and co-organized with CREX, Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. The aim of the project is to analyze Islamophobia as a global phenomenon, and you are welcome to visit our website, intersectingflows.com. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bharat Ganesh, who is Assistant Professor of Media Studies, University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Bharat is a political geographer focusing on new media, political communication, and cultures of hate and intolerance online, using computational and qualitative methods. Prior to joining the University of Groningen, Bharat was a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. He has written extensively on far-right online activism, content moderation, and algorithmic bureaucracy. The title of the talk today is Flows of Islamophobia in Transatlantic Far-Right Digital Publics. Bharat will speak for 30 minutes, and then we will have an open Q&A session. Please send your questions in the question section at Zoom. We have locked the chat function. Bharat's talk, but not the Q&A session, will be recorded, and for that reason, we will not do video participation for the attendees. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Bharat on this very timely and important topic. The floor is yours, Bharat.
Okay, thank you, Iselin, for that very nice introduction. I'll just share my slides now. We go, and I'll just put it in full screen mode. Iselin, is it on full screen now?
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll get started then. Again, thanks a lot for having me. It's really nice to be able to discuss some of this research. And thanks to all of those who are listening in from home and all over. So my talk today is going to focus on flows of Islamophobia in transatlantic far-right digital publics. So I know that that's a bit of a mouthful, and I'll try to explain what I mean by those different terms as we go along. But one of the interesting things I think about the INTERSECT project that Iselin is leading is this idea about Islamophobia as a flow. And that was one of the things that I was asked to think about a little bit in preparation of this talk. So one of the things I'm going to try to look at are what are the kinds of imaginaries, what are the kinds of tropes, and what are the kinds of media objects that seem to travel between North America and Western Europe in my research. So that's really what I'm going to be looking at, is how particular kinds of media objects flow and the role of Islamophobia in them. So as kind of a basic outline, I'm going to talk about 4 different points. So the first is about the centrality of Islamophobic discourse in the far-right digital publics that I've been researching. There's sort of 3 key racist tropes within this that seem to flow the most. The first refers to no-go zones, which I'm sure many of you have already come across. The sort of allegation that's entirely false, of course, of Muslim men, particularly as sexual predators. And then baseless claims that are generally kind of nonsense about the idea of the Islamization of European and other Western societies. I'm then going to move on to looking at how Islamophobia travels and in a way is sort of supported and facilitated by social media platforms. So I refer to that as platformed Islamophobia, which I'll explain a little bit later. And then finally, coming back to this idea of flow and drawing a little bit on Arjuna Padurai's ideas about mediascapes, I'm going to try to think about what might Islamophobic mediascapes look like. So just to give you an idea of where I'm starting from is I'm trying to look at, with a series of different research projects, primarily undertaken with collaboratively with Caterina Froyo at Sciences Po, is trying to develop and understand this kind of concept that we've called the far-right digital public. So here we're drawing on a lot of ideas within media studies about social media and kind of thinking what some have called networked publics. And in this, what we're trying to do is try to make sense of the different kinds of actors, the different kinds of people involved in disseminating and engaging in far-right activism through social media. So what we've done is we've defined far-right digital public as follows: as an assemblage of far-right leaders, political parties, social movements, and audiences that are able to interact in specific ways afforded by the architecture of a platform. So in two papers with Katerina, what we've done is we've identified a set of about 40 far-right leaders. So here we're talking about, for example, people like Marine Le Pen, Matteo Salvini, as well as kind of different kinds of social media, social movements such as Pegida, the English Defense League, as well as kind of key leaders in extreme right movements, such as Paul Golding from Britain First, and also individuals like Tommy Robinson. And what we've been trying to do is understand what kinds of discourses are being shaped through these sorts of these publics. And so one of the things we've done to do that is, instead of just looking at, for example, what Tommy Robinson and Marine Le Pen and many of the others you can see on this slide have said, what we've tried to do is get a sense of how it is that audiences interact with these kinds of actors. So that's why we refer to this as a digital public. What we're trying to do is understand the ways in which different kinds of relationships are being built on these platforms, and the ways in which audiences are engaging with these kinds of with far-right leaders, political parties, and social movements. So that's a bit of the context to these to this research, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we've been trying to do with the data we've collected from Twitter. Now, one of the things we've been working on is also in what ways this has become transnational. So we've looked at, primarily looking at transnationalism collaboratively, looking at relationships between Germany, France, Italy, and the UK, focusing on Western Europe. But in my own work, I've also been looking at flows between the United States and the UK. So that's why I framed this talk as well around the idea about far-right digital publics being transatlantic. I think another key point we need to think about here is also that platforms shape the forms of communication that can be observed. So one of the key things to remember is that a lot of this research really does tend to focus on Twitter, primarily because Twitter makes it, compared to Facebook and other social media platforms, Twitter makes it relatively easy to get data. That is changing now, and we're working on sort of looking at other platforms. But what that means is that what we're able to look at is also really shaped by the platform. And so it's important to remember that Twitter is being used primarily to broadcast for these politicians, these leaders in these social movements. So it's really about disseminating information. There's been a lot of discussion, I think, in recent years in the literature on kind of political communication on Twitter, suggesting that it's quite interactive. But actually what we found is that, and this is with regards to the far right, but even more so with regards to just the way politicians use Twitter in general, there's been a lot of information that sort of suggests that Twitter is really being used primarily as a broadcast mechanism. What is kind of interesting, though, and developed in this paper by Falaska et al., is this idea that audiences are sort of inscribed in this activity in a particular kind of way, and they use the term digital political labor to refer to that. So, as politicians are kind of broadcasting their ideas on to a particular public, right, within whatever country they might be campaigning in, for example. They are sort of incorporating audiences' efforts as a form of digital political labor. And those efforts and that labor can take the form of sharing, clicking, and liking. And while we kind of can think about that as sort of slacktivism, in the aggregate, it can actually have a really powerful role in terms of what actually is amplified and what kinds of things get seen in sort of both within a country or within a particular public, but also in terms of the visibility of a movement as a whole abroad as well. So one of the things I've been thinking about are what are the ways in which far-right digital publics are actually incorporating audiences in a certain kind of what we can certainly agree is a thin kind of activism, but a kind of important form of political labor nonetheless. So one of the ways we've been trying to measure that is looking at, for example, and this is what this graph in the image here on the right is trying to show, is what kinds of linkages cross countries. So as you can see, for example, on the left side of this graph, there's a bunch of nodes in orange, and they're connected, and you can see kind of lines coming out from that orange set of nodes towards the green, blue, and the purple ones. And so this one in orange here represents Italy, the one in green represents France, the blue represents Germany, and the purple represents the United Kingdom. And what we can see are actually, so this graph's actually based on retweets. And what we can see is that there's quite a few, but not a lot, of connections between these different countries. And what we wanted to know is what kind of content do they need to tweet about? So for example, what kind of content does Marine Le Pen need to tweet about in order to get retweets from people in Italy, in the UK, or in Germany? So in our paper, and this one is published in European Societies, we found that actually it was nativist and anti-immigrant arguments that were most likely to create this kind of transnational relationship that we see. So those lines going between the different colored clumps, those are really kind of primarily nativist and anti-immigration tweets. And what we found was that the vast majority of all of that was really very much anti-Muslim or Islamophobic content. So I've talked a little bit about this kind of this key finding, and one of the things we claim in this paper is that the majority of these tweets, which focus on invasion and Islamization, often they also focus on they also focus on the purported oppression of women and the idea of portraying Muslim men as sexual predators, and often conflating terrorist attacks with the aspirations of all Muslims. So what we see is that Islamophobia, in a way, really builds the bridges, and we could claim that it's actually kind of the glue that holds together the different kind of national groupings of the far right, or national far right digital publics. It's Islamophobia that really brings that together into a transnational far right digital public. Another thing, and this is sort of more work in progress that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, flows between the US and the UK primarily demonstrate that UK users discussing Islam and terrorism in particular tend to be rather prominent for audiences across both countries. So again, we see this kind of attention to white women as victims of terrorism, and a lot of images and ideas and imaginaries about UK cities as being invaded. And a lot of this really seems to serve as kind of like a warning, particularly for the US, but we also see similar kinds of discourses in Canada, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And then finally, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, in Western Europe, we also see that far-right political communication, so kind of focusing on the same actors in the previous slide that you saw in this network graph here. We see that far-right political communication tends to narrate Europe as a geography that's under threat from Islamization. So I'm going to talk through some of those findings. And one of the things that I'm really excited to be able to sort of bring this together in this talk today is this idea that Islamophobia has been really central to all of this, but we've not actually been writing about Islamophobia specifically. So this is sort of my start trying to do that. So this is in a paper that I worked on some time ago, and it's published in Cultural Studies now. And one of the things I was trying to look at were, what are the different sort of segments of the alt-right, and how does it connect with the populist radical right? And in the process, one of the things I discovered was that in collecting data on an audience that was distributed between the US and the UK, but primarily skewed towards US users, there was a really high prominence of British voices, particularly in terms of who was getting retweeted the most. So if we look at these three different tweets from various kinds of sort of far-right individuals, and I'll explain who they are in a second, we see that they actually get a significant amount of attention from both the US and the UK. And what's interesting is that the tweets that I've reproduced here are the ones that were retweeted the most from those users, right? So in a way, what really seems to resonate the most across this audience is anti-Muslim and Islamophobic content. So at the top, you can see a tweet from Paul Joseph Watson, who is, I think he was the editor of InfoWars. His position's changed relatively recently, but he now runs his own alternative news site called Summit News. But he's a pretty well-known conspiracy theorist and significantly major Islamophobic figure. And so here he's developing a tweet about Muslim grooming gangs, which is this idea, again, about sort of framing Muslim men as sexual predators. And here he's actually trolling a Channel 4. Channel 4 is a major broadcaster in the UK, sort of trolling a Channel 4 news presenter named Lily Allen. So one of the things that we see here is that this kind of trope about kind of protecting white women from Muslim men is sort of constantly being repeated through this group. So Paul Joseph Watson is kind of an online micro celebrity, as some might refer to him as, but there's other types of actors here too. So Mark Collette is another one. He's a former British National Party activist, and he now is just an active fascist, both on Twitter as well as in politics in Britain. And he's been more and more involved in the alt-right in the last few years. And so this is a tweet that he's actually pinned to his Twitter account. It's been there since I collected the data back in 2018 now. And that tweet is still pinned up on his profile. And again, he's got a reference, I think, to the London Bridge attack in 2017, where he says, "This is Sarah. She was killed by Muslim terrorists because politicians care more about diversity and immigration than they do about our safety." So here, what Collette is referencing is something that we see at kind of two levels. The first one is, of course, that kind of rendering Muslims as terrorists, but also sort of laying the blame on sort of centrist and left-wing politicians that are supportive of diversity and immigration as kind of becoming complicit in the process of Islamization, and therefore sacrificing the security of British people. In this instance, I believe this woman was actually Australian. But again, one of the things I'll talk about towards the end is that there's a sort of more collective sense of whiteness and white victimization that is really central to a lot of this kind of far-right discourse. And then the third picture here, the third tweet here is from someone named Tolerant Fellow. So this is kind of a troll account. I'm not really sure who they are. But they do identify themselves as, or at least potentially being associated with Scotland, as you can see from the flag emojis that follow their name. And they say, "Someone sarcastically asked me what the race war will look like. I show them this gif of the migrant inflow to Europe." And then he claims, "Your own governments are waging the race war on you right now." And again, here what we have is kind of a reference to the kinds of theories about replacement of Europeans with migrants that have been so influential for the far right across the world. So again, these are the ideas that seem to resonate the most with the US-UK audience. Islamophobia here is really central. And one of the things that's interesting is, as I said, this audience that I've studied here and looked at who they retweet the most really skews towards the US. So I was quite surprised that especially Mark Collette and the Tolerant Man appeared in such a prominent position, right? Actually, so of those who received more than 2,000 retweets from this group I'm interested in, 3 of the 4 are British. I'm not so surprised with Paul Joseph Watson and Donald Trump, obviously, considering how prominent Paul Joseph Watson actually is outside of just this particular group. But seeing Collette and the Tolerant Men here, I think is quite interesting. So I'm going to now go into some of the tropes that I think seem to travel the most. And again, here, one of the things that I've noticed are these kinds of spatial imaginaries that seem really important, and especially spatial imaginaries about the safety of Western or white women. So this is an editorial in Breitbart by Anne-Marie Waters, who's an extremist activist in the United Kingdom and leader of the party For Britain, which is a specifically anti-Muslim political party in the UK. And in it, she writes, "Much more recently, I traveled from Copenhagen to Malmö by train. Only moments after the train entered Swedish territory, I was witness to what I can only assume to be representative of the new Sweden. A young blonde woman was jogging and had the misfortune of passing a group of men. I have been heavily criticized for describing them as Middle Eastern looking men, but that is what they were, who proceeded immediately to harass her. Readers will be more than aware that Sweden has become Europe's rape capital. It's a similar story in Denmark, where the majority of rapes are committed by immigrants, usually Muslim." I don't know if Anne-Marie Waters is on this particular graph. I should have checked a little bit earlier. But this is, but Waters kind of referenced one of these kinds of key sorts of anti-Muslim tropes. And one of the things that's interesting here is that this idea of white women being victims of non-white men, particularly through their sort of alleged and constructed ideas of them as sexual predators, goes back all the way to kind of fears about miscegenation in the United States back in the 17th and 18th century, right? So these are really well-worn, long-standing white supremacist tropes. So we can see how some of the ideas that Anne-Marie Waters and these others like Mark Collette and Paul Joseph Watson have referenced kind of being activated in the sorts of spatial imaginaries that these US and UK users have put out on Twitter. So on the left, we see a tweet, which was one of the most retweeted tweets with an image in the data set I was looking at, which refers to mass immigration as the end of Britain. And what you have here, as you can see, are women wearing hijabs walking through a market area in what appears to be a British city. In the middle, we have this post that says, "This post must never die." And as you can see, I've just kind of taken out screen names of particular users, as well as adjusted the hyperlinks so that they can't be identified. But again, so what we have here in the middle is this sort of collage of different images in which we sort of see this sort of before and after, before diversity and after diversity. So on the left, you can see at the top, sort of before diversity, you have kind of British people sort of on the street in front of a pub. And then after diversity, you have something that looks like the street scene with the tweet on the left. You have sort of, again, the repetition of blaming diversity on attacks on white women. And then towards the bottom in the third row, you can see this kind of reproduction of the big case in Rotherham in the UK, in which 1,400 young children were groomed by Asian men. And one of the key things that's stressed by this group is often that this wasn't an Asian gang, it was a Muslim gang. And of course, within that gang, there was some amount of diversity, but the perpetrators were primarily of one specific ethnic background. Again, on the right, you have another set of similar images, right? We have before diversity, you have the quite famous, of course, double-decker buses in London, and then an image of one of the 7/7 attacks and the bombs that went off on one of the buses. So again, we keep seeing the repetition of these tropes. And again, it often really centers around imaginaries of the city itself. And especially the idea of the city, especially a place like London or somewhere like Malmö or Copenhagen, being these places that are being sort of invaded and taken over by migrants. And then finally, just talk quickly about this emergency plan, which is a kind of sarcastic meme that sort of spread around after one of the terrorist attacks in the UK. So here we have this kind of first step: tearful cartoons, put up a Facebook filter on your profile picture, cry on TV, light up buildings, have candlelight vigils, but then invite in more refugees, and then call all of those who want to stop it bigots. Wait for the next attack, repeat, and do nothing. And don't worry, guys, it'll change eventually. So here we also have some of these kinds of sort of trolling aesthetics and styles kind of coming in. But again, it's focusing on diversity, on refugees, all of which are sort of codes for talking about Muslims, coming really to the center of these imaginaries of the city that seem to resonate the most with these far-right users in the US and the UK. So moving forward a little bit more, what we've also done is tried to study the spatial imaginaries of Europe. So how is it that these far-right digital publics tend to narrate Europe? And again, what we see are some of these kinds of tropes returning over and over again. So what we did was we looked at some of the, and again, this is a collaborative paper with Caterina Froyo. What we did was we looked at the words that were most associated with Europe by studying word collocations. So for example, what we see is the word across was the most collocated with Europe amongst our English-speaking audience. And they write, across Europe, gangs of migrants are attacking, robbing, and raping young women, yet we are still allowing more. In French, one of the most common collocations was partout, where they say, it is getting worse and worse everywhere in Europe. The religious war is on the move. So here we have the repetition of the tropes that I've talked about in terms of sort of Muslim men and migrants as violent and as sexual predators. This idea about Islamization not being mentioned specifically, but sort of reflecting on this idea about an impending religious war. And the last one, and this is actually from Giorgia Maloney in Italy. She writes, we want to defend our identity from the Islamization of Europe. It makes no sense to stop the Islamic invasion with centuries of war from Poitiers to Lepanto and then invade us in this way. So what we see is that, again, these imaginaries of Europe, just as much as imaginaries of the city, kind of still are frequently kind of referencing these Islamophobic tropes. So as I said earlier, this idea that we got from looking at retweets that Islamophobia is kind of this glue that holds together these far-right digital publics and brings them together in this kind of in a transnational manner. Islamophobia plays a really, I think all of this is evidence that shows that Islamophobia plays a really decisive role in this process. So, but one of the things I want to talk about here is sort of what kind or what quality of Islamophobia are we talking about? And there's this great paper by Aurélien Mondon and Aaron Winter that I think really sort of helped us to understand this. They sort of talk about two types of Islamophobia, one illiberal and the other liberal. With illiberal Islamophobia, they refer to targets targeting those who belong to visible racial or ethnic groups associated with Islam and can be witnessed in attacks, whether discursive or physical, against Muslims in mosques, but also in calls for repatriation or even genocide. So when we see things like deport them all or bomb them all, which I'll show you kind of comes up in comments from Britain First back in 2014 and 2015, this might be an example of illiberal Islamophobia. But they also refer to liberal Islamophobia, which is the creation of a loosely defined Muslim culture and community inherently and homogeneously opposed to some of the core values espoused in a mythical, essentialized, and culturally homogeneous, superior, and enlightened West. So here, and especially we get this with Marine Le Pen as well as others, what we're starting to see, I think, is that the far right is more and more adopting this kind of liberal Islamophobia in which Muslims are seen not as through the lens of kind of like old school sort of racism, but as opposed to specific kinds of values. So this could be kind of referred to as sort of cultural racism other kinds of terms that have been used to sort of think about this sort of racialization of Muslims through kind of this kind of essentialist concept of who Muslims are. And again, that they don't value, that they don't share specific values with the rest of the West, right? And I think this comes through really clearly. If any of you have seen what Emmanuel Macron has said in sort of the aftermath of the murder of the teacher in the last few weeks. But again, this kind of idea that Muslims are opposed to specific Western values. And then there's this sort of repetition of the use of tropes like they are sexual predators, and sort of problems with Islam that are entirely constructed, or the idea of Muslims as a kind of fifth column, as sort of these more palatable forms of Islamophobia that the far right's using. And again, especially by drawing on kind of this idea of kind of protecting women, there's this kind of permutation of Islamophobia, I think, allows the far right to sort of weaponize liberal Islamophobia much more effectively than illiberal Islamophobia. Mondon and Winter quote Claire Alexander, who writes that this kind of talking about these exact tropes in a 2013 article, writes that these tropes in this discourse provides grist to the mill of the born-again racism without race. Apparently, it's not racist to be anti-Muslim. And so what happens is I think that this flows into the ways in which platforms are actually trying to deal with Islamophobia or to deal with hate speech. And one of the things that we see is that Islamophobia still simply just doesn't get recognized as a form of hate speech. So platforms have rarely acted on Islamophobia, and we know that, for example, Facebook very recently decided to start acting on Holocaust denial and explicit white supremacist discourse. So it's not like platforms have done a good job about dealing with hate speech in general at all, but Islamophobia has been getting a pass for quite some time. And I think the key example of this, and we have precious little information, so those of you who've heard my other talks know I kind of bang on about this all the time, but a Channel 4 report showed that individuals like Tommy Robinson, Paul Golding, and Jada Franson of Britain First actually were flagged to Facebook's content moderators as early as 2015, but the corporation decided not to deal with it. But instead of not dealing with hate speech on the on those pages and from those accounts, they actually gave them special review, which essentially gave them cover from the platform's moderation policies. And the last point, and I think this is really important today, is that these sort of clearly false narratives about no-go zones, about kind of construction of Muslims as sexual threats, spreading paranoia about Islamization, all of which are false, are forms of propaganda that are spread systematically by individuals and influencers on social media, racist news sites like Breitbart and Daily Caller, for example. That's just scratching the surface, as well as in political communication. So we see this from Trump and Le Pen, of course, as well as many others. And what's interesting is we don't get to see, these are false narratives. They're demonstrably false, yet they don't really seem to be recognized as disinformation in scholarship or policy. So when we look, for example, at audits of Facebook's recent work on trying to address hate speech, or we look at the literature on disinformation, there's a lot of focus on, for example, what many have termed alternative news or junk news, for example. But the sort of kind of more common forms of disinformation, which again, a lot of it really does focus on Islamophobia, doesn't really get recognized as such, despite the fact that it can be recognized as disinformation based on the kinds of definitions disinformation as sort of systematically and deliberately deceitful kinds of information that are false in order to affect people's opinions. So again, one of the things I'd like to do here is to suggest that what we're talking about is also platformed Islamophobia, that it's not, and this builds off of the idea of platform racism developed by Ariadna Matamoros Fernandez. And the idea about platformed racism and platformed Islamophobia is that actually Islamophobia and racism are supported by the affordances of platforms rather than actually being policed by them. So again, here is an example of this from Britain First. So on the left, what you have is actually an infographic of a report when I was working at Tell Mama, which is an organization in the UK that was working to counter and monitor anti-Muslim hate crimes in the country. So on the left, you have this infographic of words associated with Muslim in Facebook comments from August 2014. And what we see are kind of words like scum being collocated with Muslim, but as well as verbs like send and bomb, which referred to kind of actual violent threats. We said to Facebook, you've got to do something about this page, right? And so we gave them this report. And this was before we found out that actually, even after we had given them this report, Britain First was still benefiting from what the company referred to as special review. We then found out by May 2018 that Facebook had finally decided to ban Britain's First page. And that's after Jada Franson was retweeted by Donald Trump, and both of them were arrested, right? So again, this is a really minimal response that these companies take. And then finally, as of 2019, journalists had found that Britain First Paul Golding was again trying to advertise on Facebook's platform. And this ad is one example of that. In another project with a few colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, including Phil Howard and Mimi Lotsu, and John Kelly and Kemi Francois of Graphica in New York, we were asked by the US Senate to take a look at thousands and thousands of Facebook posts that the Internet Research Agency, which many of you probably know is that infamous troll farm in St. Petersburg that tried to meddle and was indicted by Robert Mueller for trying to meddle in the US election in 2016. And what we found was that actually the top performing page that the Internet Research Agency had set up on Facebook was called Stop AI. AI is not artificial intelligence in this case, but Stop All Invaders. And again, what we had was a repetition on this page of a lot of racist content towards migrants. And of course, this was targeting the US. So there was a lot of anti-Muslim content, as well as a lot of reference to Latinos as illegals. So again, these are ads. So on the left here, this image of Barack Obama is a very obvious example of disinformation. And this was an ad that was purchased and spread by Facebook. So the Internet Research Agency had purchased this ad, and Facebook ran it and delivered it to people's screens, right? And this primed their page to get loads and loads of different kinds of interactions from people in the millions with similar kinds of content. And so actually this, if you look at the area graph on the right here, you can see that sort of the brown section there that's being pointed to. That's actually the number of likes that this particular campaign got from these kinds of advertisements that they ran on Facebook. So again, this was actually the most prominent in terms of likes on the Facebook platform from the different campaigns that the Internet Research Agency ran. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I want to talk about, I think, just to draw a few of these themes together. And I know I haven't talked too much about flows, but I think what I've tried to stress is that what we have are particular kinds of content and media objects that really, that we can measurably say use Islamophobia in order to bring far-right digital publics together. So I think sort of drawing on Apaturai's idea about kind of flows in the global cultural economy, what we can see here is that Islamophobia might be sort of, as a sort of set of global flows, might be theorized as a set of ethnoscapes, which refer, of course, to kind of diasporic imaginaries. And what we're seeing, especially with this kind of idea about sort of white people spread out across North America and Europe as being kind of under attack, ostensibly from Muslims, is one example of a kind of ethnoscape that we might sort of begin to think about. Idea about mediascapes, which are again global sorts of sets of relations. I think the idea of a far-right digital public plays very well into that concept. and the idea of technoscapes, especially with the fact that Islamophobia is increasingly platformed by social media companies and the technical, the media technologies that we use today, and their intersection with specific kinds of ideologies, which again, flow across the world, and especially these kinds of far-right ideologies, but particular constructions of whiteness as well, is an important point at which these four pieces kind of intersect together. And I think that's one of the sort of conjunctures we can look at when we're thinking about what Islamophobia is. And I want to point out that these flows really are contingent on specific imagined geographies of the West, both under threat and facing a cultural crisis. I think it's important to learn that to stress that Islamophobia serves as a white racial project for the far right, as a way of integrating a well-worn set of racist tropes, such as, again, non-white men as sort of threats to white women, and discourse on Islamization as a more kind of polite or way to reiterate these kinds of ideas about invasion and replacement, which are very common for the extreme right. As well, Islamophobia, sort of through the conjuncture of these multiple flows and across these different kinds of scapes, is reproduced. And I think it's important to think about this as a disposition that becomes valuable for political communication. And platforms have to date really enabled rather than challenged Islamophobia. So platforms, I think, are really culpable as well as the politicians in terms of the weaponization of Islamophobia as a kind of political discourse, not only to win votes, but also to gain prominence and disseminate these different kinds of ideas that we see with the far right. And then finally, I think one of the ways I would go if I hopefully in the future, when I sort of try to work this into a paper, would be trying to think about what are the ways in which Islamophobia becomes tightly wound to a sense of whiteness being under threat across the Atlantic. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening. As well, here are the different references. Yeah, I look forward to the discussion to come.